Hello and welcome to another part of this tutorial series. In this video I'm going to add the ability to collect the building resources. Before we start, let's fix a little mistake I made in the previous video here in the building script. In the save location function, and here we're gonna say equals to false. Now, in order to add the ability to collect resources, we need a storage for our resources. So let's create another building. To do that, I'm just gonna use the building we've already created for gold mine. Let me drag it into our scene, and I'm just gonna name it gold storage, and I'm going to change the shape just to make it look different than our gold mine building. So I'm just gonna add another cube here. And let's bring it up and scale it down a little. It doesn't matter as long as it looks different so we could know which building is which. And here I'm gonna add an ID of gold storage, and that's it. I'm gonna drag it into my buildings prefab folder. Let's also create a town hall. I'm gonna change the ID to town hall as well, and here let's make it look different than the others. I'm just gonna add a sphere to the top of it, something like that, and let's make a prefab out of this one as well, and let me delete that. Now let's go to the canvas, and here in the UI main I'm just going to add these buildings that we just created, and in the shop let's enable these elements. Let's go to the buildings list, and here this is going to be gold mine, and I'm going to duplicate this and name it gold storage. The ID also going to be gold storage, and we're not going to add the town hall here because when you create the game you already have the town hall, you don't have it in the shop. And let me change the text for this one to gold storage as well, and that's it. Let me close this and save my scene, and let's go to the database, and here in my server buildings I'm going to go to the insert, and for the global ID of gold storage level 1, let's say it takes 500 elixirs or whatever. The columns count is 3 and this one 3 as well, and let's insert this. Now in the browse we also have a gold storage, and let's also insert the town hall. And let's just temporarily set the size to 3 in 3, but we know the town hall is a little bigger than the other buildings. We're gonna handle that later. And now let's go to our server. Here is my server project, and here in the Authenticate Player we're calling this function. Let's go here, and whenever the player does not have an account we're gonna insert an account for it. But we also need to give the player a bunch of default buildings. So to do that, I am going to insert a few buildings as well, starting with the town hall. So let me just copy this, and I'm going to paste it here. And instead of this query, I think we have a query down here in the place building. Yeah, let me just copy this from here, and let's go up and paste it here. So instead of building ID I'm just gonna pass town hall, and this is going to be 25 in 25, and this is going to be 3 in 3. Of course I'm going to change this is only temporarily, we don't need the last insert ID. So when you start you also have a town hall. And to test this, let's go to the database and the accounts. I want to delete this account. In the buildings I'm gonna delete all the buildings, and let's start the server. And here in the Unity editor I'm gonna play the game, and here we go. This is our town hall. We can move it around, and we also can create a gold mine, and we can create gold storage. Okay, I don't think we have enough resources to add more buildings, so let me stop the game. So I'm gonna go to the database here in the server buildings. I'm gonna go to the structure, and we need to add a bunch of other columns that we're gonna use later. So I'm gonna add 5 columns. Let's say the first one is capacity, the second one is speed, the other one is health, the other one should be damage, and the last one, let's say, is radius. So the capacity is going to be an integer with the default value of 0. I'm going to make the speed a float with the default value of 0. Health is an integer, let's say by default is 100. Damage is a float and by default is 0. And last one, radius, also is a float and by default it's 0. I'm gonna save this. Now here in our server building we have a bunch of other columns that we can use. Here in the buildings table, I'm gonna go to structure and add a couple of columns as well. The first one is going to be storage and the second one is going to be boost. So the storage, I'm gonna make it a float. The default for it is 0. Boost is going to be a date time, and the default value is going to be current timestamp. And these two values, columns count and rows count, in the buildings are unnecessary. I can just go ahead and delete them. Let me select them and hit drop. The reason I deleted them is because in the server building we already have a columns count and rows count. We can just use this, we don't need to use those. And here in the accounts, I'm going to delete this elixir and gold field. Let's go to the structure, and here elixir and gold, I'm going to delete those as well because those two columns are no longer represent the amount of gold and elixir that we have. Instead, here in the buildings, this gold storage has a storage field, so the value of this storage field is the amount of gold and elixir that we have. And let's go to our server project now. Let me stop the server. Here in the data script, I'm going to find my building class and add the columns that we just created in our database. And I'm going to copy this class and paste it in my client as well. Let me find the scripts, and here the data class. I'm just gonna replace it with this one. And let's also add the namespace system. Now let's go back to the database. Here in the server buildings, my gold mine, let's say, produces 200 golds per hour. So I'm gonna set the speed of gold mine level 1 to 200 per hour. And this gold mine has the capacity to hold, let's say, 1000. Of course, I'm just writing these values. Later we need to calculate and create the game logic to write reasonable values. But for now, let's just leave it like this. And the gold storage has, let's say, 10,000 gold capacity. And now let's go to the server. In the database, let's find the player sync class. So here it is, sync player data. It is calling this function. Let me expand that as well. So right now we don't have a gold and elixir, so this is gonna give us an error. So let me just delete them, and let's also delete them here because we are no longer have a column named gold or elixir. This comment also is unnecessary. And here in the place buildings, we no longer have rows count in our buildings table. So let me remove those two as well. So here they are. Let me remove it completely, and that should take care of any error that might pop up. And also let me check here. When you place a building, you spend some resources, but as you know, we removed the gold and elixir from our database, so we no longer have those values. So let's just create a function for it, and I'm gonna say private static bool, and here I'm just gonna say return true, and let's say long account ID and int gold. Let's just make it spend resources. And here, instead of calling it like this, I'm just gonna say spend resources, passing the account ID, and also let's pass these values. Just gonna cut those, paste it here, and for the dark elixir I'm gonna pass 0, delete that, and here let's say string. So we're gonna do that later. So here in the place building, as you can see, we are checking to see if the player has the gold or elixir. We also need to handle that later. By deleting those columns, we broke the project, so we need to fix it one step at a time. But for now, let's just do the important stuff, then we're gonna come back and fix these little ones as well. And let's check for more problems. Here in the Git building async, are we referencing this from somewhere? No, so let me just delete this one. And here in the Git server buildings, this is getting the server building data. Let's go to the function that is getting the buildings data. Here it is. So we need to fix this SQL statement here in the Get Buildings async. Instead of saying select ID, we need to say select buildings.id, because we are going to left join the server buildings into this buildings. So let's say buildings.id. Let me just copy that, paste it for the global, for the level X position, Y position. And these two, as you remember, we deleted them in the buildings, but they do exist in the server buildings, so we're gonna get them from server buildings. So server buildings dot columns count, let me copy and paste it, server buildings row count. So we're gonna select all of those. Let me also add a bunch of more variables. Let's say server buildings, I'm gonna copy and paste it, and one of them was speed, the other one was capacity. Let me add another one, it was health, and one more for damage, and I think the last one was radius. And let's go back here after buildings.y position. Let's add another one and say storage, and another one, let me paste it, is going to be boost. So we're gonna say select all of those, from buildings, but we're gonna say left join server buildings on buildings.global ID equals to server building dot global ID, and buildings.level equals to server buildings.level. And that is the condition for our left join. And for the where, we're gonna say buildings dot account ID equals to that. So that way it will get all the values for us. And let's also add the extra values. I'm just gonna copy these and let me paste it here. Let's start by health. It's an integer. Damage is a float, I think. Speed is also a float. Opacity was an integer. Storage was a float in the database, but an integer in our class, so we need to say storage, and it is a float. I'm gonna say math dot floor. I'm gonna floor the value in the database, and I'm gonna cast it as an integer. And of course we had the boost value. It was a date time, and I think we had one more value. It was radius. And now let's go back to the client, and here in the player script, let's go and find sync data. We are no longer receiving these values with the player, so let me cut those and bring them down here. And here I'm gonna define a bunch of integers. And now I'm just gonna use this to assign the text values. So now to get the value for these ones, let's actually go to the data and create an enum. I'm gonna name it building ID. And here in the building class, instead of saying a string, it's gonna be of type building ID. I'm also going to go to the building, and up here, instead of this, I'm gonna say data dot building ID. And do the same thing in the UI building. There's also an ID here. Let's name it data dot building ID. So as you can see, there is a bunch of error pops up here in the UI main instance get building prefab. Let's go to the definition of this function, and here instead of saying a string, we're gonna say data dot building ID. So that is going to fix that. Let's also go to the Unity editor here in the prefabs buildings, and we need to change these values. Of course, we have an error. We need to compile the code first. Here in the confirm button, we need to say to a string. So it's gonna change the ID to a string value. Of course, later it would be better to just pass an integer, but for now, let's just leave it like that. I'm not gonna handle the server side. Let's just do the client first. Now, if we go back to the editor, we'll see that we can now go to the prefabs, select the gold mine, put it on gold mine, gold storage on gold storage, and of course the town hall is on town hall. And now let's go to the shop. Here in the elements, we have a gold mine. Let's change it to gold mine, and we also have a gold storage. That's also going to do that. Now let's go to the player script, and here in the sync data, we need to get the values for these two variables. So here, I'm not gonna create another building, I'm just gonna delete that, and let's just use this building here. So if we don't have it, we're just gonna instantiate and assign the value. This is also building, and let's create an data.building in this building script. So let's say public data.building, and I'm just gonna name it data equals to, and I'm going to make it hide in inspector. Let's actually make it a new building. So that's that, and let's go to the player. The first thing we're gonna do, I'm just gonna say building the data equals to player the buildings I, and now I'm gonna do a switch between building dot ID. So if the building type is a gold storage, our max gold is gonna be plus equals to building dot data dot capacity, and our gold plus equals to building dot data dot storage. Right now we're focused on the gold. Later we create the buildings for Elixir and other resources, but for now, if we create one of them, and we can use that as a template to create the other ones. Let's just build the foundation for the gold, and let's go back to the editor. I'm going to go to the UI and create another script, name it UI button. I'm gonna open this UI button, and let me just add my namespace like usual. I'm gonna say using Unity Engine .ui. So the first thing I need to do, I'm gonna create a public button, and I'm just gonna name it button. And of course I need to create a public rect transform, and I'm gonna name that rect. Here in the awake function, I'm gonna say rect dot anchor minimum equals to vector 2.0, and the same thing for the anchor max. And I'm also add a listener to my onDestroy, and here I'm gonna say button dot onClick event dot remove all the listeners. So that's my button. I'm just gonna close it. Now here in my canvas, in the main game object, and here in the elements, I'm just gonna create an empty game object, and I'm gonna bring it up here. Anything inside this game object, let's actually name it icons. Anything inside this icons game object will be under any UI element. So that's gonna be under the rest of them, and let's make it fill its parent. And here I'm just gonna create a UI button, and this button is going to be button collect gold. So I'm just gonna delete this text, we don't need that. I could create an image under it as an icon, and this button collect gold, I'm gonna add a UI button to it. So that is going to be the button, and also that is going to be the rect. So here, let me create a folder. I'm gonna name it sprites. Let me open this up. Here in my desktop, I have this icon. I'm gonna drag and drop it here. I'm gonna be using this as an sprite. So I'm gonna select this and assign this one. Let's see, I'm gonna say preserve aspect, and this image, let me fill the parent 0, 0, 0, 0. Let's go to the 2D view. So I'm gonna increase the size to something like this, and this image, let's say a circle, and let me just reduce the bounds. Let's say 0, 0, 0. I'm just gonna create a gold shape. Of course, later we could use a gold icon, but let's just use this one. Let's give it a color. Well, let's say that's a gold. And I'm gonna check the preserve aspect. So that is our collect gold button. And let's also make sure this image, I'm gonna uncheck raycast target so it would not cover this button. Here in the prefabs, I am going to create another folder, name it buttons, and inside this I'm gonna drag and drop this button. Now let me just delete that. Let's go to the UI main script. Down here I'm just gonna create a header. Let's name it buttons. The first one is gonna be a public transform. I'm gonna name it buttons parent, and the second one is going to be a public UI button. So it's gonna be button collect gold. And let's go back to the editor and assign the value of these two variables. So here in the UI main, I have two variables. The icons is going to be buttons parent, and here in the buttons, the collect gold button we've created is going to be that. Now let's go to the scripts folder. Here in the building, I'm going to create two more variables. Let me just copy this and paste it here. The first one is going to be a UI button. It's going to be collect button, and let's say it's null. And the second one, I'm also going to copy this. The second one is going to be a boolean, and it's going to be, say, collecting, and it's going to equal to false. Let's get down here and say private void update, and I'm also going to create another function, just UI, and here in every frame I'm just gonna call this a just UI. So if the collect button is not null, then I'm gonna switch between the ID, and if the ID is goldmine, so let's go to the data and create a variable. Let's say public const, and it's gonna be an integer. Let's say minimum gold collect, let's say 10. So if our gold mine has at least 10 golds inside of it, then we're gonna show a collect button on top of it. Otherwise we don't show any buttons. So let's go back to the buildings and check if our data dot storage, the amount of gold you have in the storage, greater or equal than data dot minimum gold collect. And we'll also add an else. Here we're gonna say button collect dot game object set active false. And let me just copy this and paste it here, and here I'm gonna say is not equal to collecting. Now if you remember, here in the UI build we had the ability to show two buttons, a red and green button, around the buildings to confirm or cancel the build. We need to use these values to do a similar thing. Before we do that, let's make this function a little bit more efficient. So let me go to my camera controller, and here on top of my camera control, let's go back to the UI build and copy these two variables and bring them here to the camera controller. I'm just gonna paste them over here, and of course the default value is going to be 0. and I'm going to make them public. And here in the update function, let me find it. At the end of the update function, let's go back here and copy these two values, paste them again, and remove this vector3. I'm gonna get the value for them, and of course the function is already in the camera controller. I don't need to use the instance. And here in the UI build, instead of doing that, I'm just gonna say camera controller.instance.playing down left and playing top right. So I'm gonna copy this part of this code and let's bring it back to the building. And here on this part of the code, I'm just gonna paste that. And here I'm just gonna say collect button dot rect dot anchored position equals to that. And let me just remove that. And instead of confirm point, I'm just gonna say screen point. And instead of passing the building dot build instance, I'm just gonna pass this building. While we're here, let's also create a public function. Let's say public void collect. So we're gonna use this function later, but the second we press this button, the collect button, the game object will be set to false, and of course the collecting equals to true. And we also create a packet equals to new packet. The packet type is going to be, let's go to the player and create the type for it. Let's say collect and equals to 5. So back in the building, I'm gonna say packet dot write, and the first one is going to be the ID of the packet, which is a player dot request ID dot collect, and the second one I'm just gonna pass the building ID, which is going to be the data dot database ID, and at the end we're gonna use the sender to send this package. So let's go back to the player script. Here in the sync data, if our building is a gold mine, the first thing we check to see if our building does have a collect button or not. If it doesn't, then we're gonna create one for it. And we're gonna instantiate it using UI main.instance.button collect gold, and we're gonna choose a parent for it, UI main.instance.buttons parent, and here we're gonna say building.collect button.button.onClick.add listener, and we're gonna pass the building.collect. And after this switch statement, I'm just gonna say building.adjust UI. Let's go to the building and make this adjust UI a public function. And here in the player, let's say adjust UI. And when we receive an answer from the server, we should get it from here in the packet received. After this case, let's add another case, collect, and we should expect a long, which is the database ID equals to packet.readLong, and we also need to expect an integer, which is going to be the amount that we collected. So let's say packet.readInteger. And let's also use a debug.log for now. and we need to create a for loop saying UI main dot instance dot grid dot buildings. I'm gonna loop through them, and if I found this database ID, let me just copy this and say I dot data dot database ID. I'm gonna copy this and say dot collecting obviously is going to be false, and also I'm gonna say data dot storage minus equals to the amount that was collected. And let me paste it one more time and adjust the UI, and at the end I'm gonna break from this for loop. And while we are here in the player, let's create another function. Let's say private bool connected, and also create a private float, name it timer. So here the connected equals to false by default, but let's go to here when we get the response to authentication. I'm gonna paste that here and set the connected to true and also timer to 0. And let's go and find our disconnect method. Here disconnected from the server, I'm gonna set the connected to false. And I'm going to create the update function. Here I'm gonna check if we are connected or not. If we are, I'm gonna check to see if the timer greater or equal than, let's say, 3. Of course you can choose any number. It means every 3 seconds sync the player data with the server. The higher number is better for the server load, and the lower number is bad for the server, but your client updates more frequently with the server. Doesn't matter, the higher number is better. Here on the else, I'm gonna say timer plus equals to time.delta time, and here timer equals to 0, and of course I'm gonna say send sync request. So I think we handled everything on the client side. Let's go to the server side. Here on the database, we actually have a huge problem that I'm gonna fix a part of it right now and the other parts in the next videos. The problem is right now we are creating one connection to the database and we are keep using that single connection. But if the number of user gets increased, you're gonna get an error because you cannot have multiple data readers open on a single connection. So to fix the problem, every time we try to run a MySQL query, we're gonna create a new connection. And of course, the MySQL is going to handle the pooling itself. So that is also a perk. So basically, I'm gonna delete this part later, of course, but for now, I'm gonna create an alternative for it. Let's say public static MySQL connection, and I'm gonna say get MySQL connection. So let's create a MySQL connection. Just gonna name it connection equals to, I'm just gonna use one of these. Let's say copy this one equals to that. So connection equals to this, but at the end I'm also going to add a parameter called pooling equals to true. So let's go back here and I am going to open the connection saying connection.open, and I'm gonna return this connection. Now let's create a couple of variables. The first one is going to be a private static date time, and the second one is going to be a private static boolean, Let me remove that. And also I'm going to create a public static void called update. And here in the terminal, let's go back to the update. Here I'm gonna say database.update. So let's go back to the database. I'm gonna say if we are not collecting, create a double, and this is going to be delta time equals to date time now minus collect time dot total seconds. And let's say if our delta time greater or equal than, let's say, 5 seconds, we want to collect resources every 5 seconds. I'm gonna say collecting equals to true, collect time equals to date time now. And of course we need to create a function. Let's go down here. I'm just gonna get a copy of this one and this one, for example, doesn't matter, and let's paste it down here. Let's rename them. Let's make it a private and say update collect, and pass a double as delta time. We're gonna do the same thing here, and let me just clear all the contents of this first function. I'm gonna say await update collect async. We're gonna pass the delta time, and here collecting equals to false. So from now on, instead of doing it like this, we're gonna say using MySQL connection, let's name it connection equals to get MySQL connection, the function we just created, and let me cut this value inside this. Instead of using this MySQL connection, we're just gonna use connection. So here I'm gonna say update buildings, and we're gonna left join server buildings. On buildings global ID equals to server buildings global ID, and buildings level equals to server buildings level. Let's say something, but let's do the where first. Where buildings dot global ID equals to, or let's say n instead of equals to, and open and close parentheses, and the first one is gold mine. We could also pass elixir mine, which we will create later. Now we're gonna set the buildings dot storage equals to buildings dot storage plus some value, and this value is going to be server buildings dot speed, which is the amount of resources it's gonna produce per hour multiplied by how much time has been passed, let's say 0, and this value is going to be delta time divided by 3600 d. This is the amount of seconds in 1 hour, so we're gonna multiply that, and we also need to multiply this by another value. We're gonna say if buildings dot boost greater or equal than now, which means we have boost right now, we're gonna say multiply it by 2, otherwise multiply it by 1. So that's one query down. Let me create another one. I'm just gonna paste it down here and remove that string. We're gonna run another query. This time we're gonna say where server buildings ID inside of this, and we also need to add another condition saying buildings dot storage greater than server buildings dot capacity, and we don't pass any parameters, so let me just remove that. And here in the set area we're gonna say building storage equals to server buildings dot capacity, and that's it. I'm gonna just remove the rest of this line. Okay, now we need to call this function from our update. Here let's say update collect, and we're gonna pass the delta time. So that's it. Let's go back and create a couple of other functions to handle our collect situation. Let me just paste it down here, and this is going to be collect, and this is going to be collect async. It takes an integer and a long, which is our building database ID. Here the first thing we're gonna say long account ID. So that is our account ID, and here this one is going to take a long, which is the account ID, and another long, which is our building database ID. So the first thing we're gonna create a packet. I'm gonna give this packet an ID. Well, let's add the collect to our request IDs. Here in the data, I'm gonna add collect. So this is gonna be collect, and this collect async is going to return an integer. So up here I'm gonna say integer amount equals to 0, and at the end I'm gonna return the amount, and here I'm gonna say integer amount equals to await collect async account ID and database ID, and at the end I'm gonna write the database ID and amount. And finally I'm gonna send the packet to this ID. So now let's handle this collect async. First I'm gonna create a string, name it global ID. Now let me clear these values, and we need a select statement. Let's find one. Here it is. Just gonna take a copy and paste it here, and I say select storage and global ID. Let me clear the rest of it, and it's gonna be from buildings, where ID is equals to this database ID that has been passed, and account ID equals to this account ID that has been passed. So we're gonna select all the buildings. So here if we have any rows, we only need 2 of these fields. One of them of course is going to be global ID, and let me remove this int parse. It's gonna be a string, and the other one is going to be amount, which is going to be the value of our storage. Let's say amount, and it's gonna be a float, and I'm gonna say math.floor. I'm gonna floor the value and then cast it to an integer. This is the amount of resources that we can collect from this particular building, and if that amount is greater than 0, we're gonna create another string. Let's say a storage global ID, and I'm gonna do a switch between the global ID. So we're saying if the global ID is gold mine, then storage global ID equals to gold storage. The same thing for other kind of resources. Let me copy this, paste it here and here. And here we're gonna check if our storage global ID is null or empty or not. If it is, then we're just gonna set the amount to 0 and move on. Otherwise, I'm gonna create a list of buildings, and to populate these buildings I need to run a SQL statement. Let me use get buildings async because I'm gonna do exactly something like this. Let me just copy everything and paste it here under the list of my buildings. Here at the end, instead of data, I'm gonna say buildings dot add this building. So let's go up here, but I only need a few variables. I only need ID and storage. Let me clear the rest of it. Also need the capacity. Let me see, here it is. So I'm just gonna remove everything else. So I'm gonna say select buildings ID, building storage, server buildings capacity from buildings, left join server buildings on those values, where buildings account ID equals to account ID, and of course this is a problem, we need to fix that. We need to remove this from the variable. Let's actually go and fix it on the get buildings async. Yeah, we copied the code from here, so it's also a problem here. We shouldn't add those marks. Good thing we figured it out because it would have caused an error. Let's go back. So here we're gonna say buildings account ID equals to that, and buildings dot global ID equals to this, and because this is in a string, then we need to add those marks. And here we're gonna say storage global ID. So let's go back here. As you remember, we only use capacity, storage, and database ID. So let's just get the storage like that. I'm just gonna paste it here, building dot storage, and finally let's go here and check if we have any buildings. So if we have any storage buildings, which means then we can collect those resources and put it in these storage buildings. We need to distribute it amongst any storages that we have. So I'm gonna say int remained equals to amount, and amount equals to 0. Now let's do a for loop. But before that, if we don't have any storages, let's add an else here. Amount is going to be 0 because we did not collected anything. And here the first thing we check, we say if we do not have anything remained, we're just gonna break from this loop. Let's create another integer available. I'm gonna say capacity minus storage is going to be the available space in this building. So if we have available space, then we can collect those resources inside this space. So in this case, we're gonna say collect equals to remained, otherwise collect equals to all the available space. And here we need to run a couple of SQL statements. So we're gonna say remained at the end minus equals to collect and amount plus equals to collect. So let's copy and paste a statement for this part. Let me see, here it is. We have something like this. So I'm going to copy that. Here it is. I'm going to paste it. So I'm going to say update buildings. Let me just clear all of that. Update buildings set storage equals to storage minus this, which is the collect value, and where ID equals to database ID. And let me see, I'm just gonna copy this and paste it here one more time, and let's say storage plus, and it's going to be buildings I dot database ID. So that should do that. Let me save this, and here in the terminal, whenever we receive a request from client, if that request is collect, let's go to the client and see what we are sending. Here in the building script, collect, the first one is the ID, the second one is the database ID. So we're sending a database ID. Let me just copy it from here, paste it here. Let's say dbid. So we're gonna call database.collect. Let's make it public. Apparently it is private. So here it is. I'm gonna say collect. I'm gonna pass the client ID and this database ID. So let's play the server and see what we did. And let's go and play the client as well. Let's hope we don't have any errors. Okay, we have the buildings, but let's go back to the database actually. Here in the buildings, as you can see, our gold mine is collecting resources. As the time passes, let me actually close the client, because this server side doesn't rely on the client. Let me refresh this buildings. As you can see, this value just changed. So as the time passes, this gold mine is gathering resources and stores it inside itself. So let me refresh it one more time. As you can see, here it is. This value is keep increasing. Well, it's a little bit slow. Let me go to the server buildings and increase the speed. Here it is, gold mine. The speed is 200. Let's make it 2000 per hour. So let's go back to the building. Here it is. And let me play the client. So here in the buildings, we are having enough resources to show the collect button, but it is not showing it for some reason. Let's double check. Here in the player, after we update the list of the buildings here in the sync data, so the problem is here, if the building.collect button equals to null, then we're gonna create a button for it. So let's go back to the client and play the game. And as you can see, we have a collect button here. Let me click that. So we have an error in the server. Let me stop the server and check this out. It's saying it cannot find a global ID. Which function is it? It is collect async. And of course, yes, this line is extra. Let me just remove that. And let's play it again. Everything should work fine now. Let me close that. So let's play this one. As you can see, we have the collect button. I'm gonna click it. Collected 323. And as you can see, here is 323. And as you can see, the collect button is not appearing right now because the amount inside the building storage haven't reached 10, but it just reached 10 and it appeared again. So I'm gonna collect it one more time, this time 14 gold. And easy like that, even if I close this, even if I close the client, the server is keep collecting these resources for me. Here it is, the gold mine. Let me refresh it, it just became 11. And as you can see, the gold storage containing 337 golds. That is the amount we collected. Let me refresh this. This amount is constant because we haven't collected this value, so any value we collect from here will be stored here in one of these gold storages. So basically that's that. We've just implemented a collecting system for our resource gathering buildings. The video got very long, so I'm gonna stop for now. Hopefully in the next video I can do more. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and thank you for watching.